All right, right now we have two modern examples of full-blown SHTF occurring around the world. And what those examples have taught us is that we were wrong about SHTF in many ways, and we can learn a lot from comparing those two examples in order to better prepare for how things might be for us here in the United States if we were to experience something similar. And what we're seeing is that a lot of these people are still doing daily life, but they're gonna have a lot of disruptions and struggles in that process, but the bills are still gonna have to be paid somehow, and there's a lot more to talk about it as well. We're going to be discussing Gaza and Ukraine because I think that they show two different versions of SHTF that can either be accomplished via a timeline based on morphing from Ukraine's current situation into Gaza's eventually with enough time passing with no improvement, or immediately going from one to the other depending on where you are at currently. And based on our current infrastructure and our current structure in general economically, there's a good chance we would emulate Ukraine, but could eventually become Gaza if things progressively got worse. So let's go through and compare the two and talk about all the reasons why we were wrong about SHTF, why you're still going to be paying your bills, why you're still going to be going to work, and all of those things. But first, I do want to mention something about my recent AI video regarding threat detection surveillance and how a lot of your data was sourced through data brokers in order for these systems to accomplish bypassing the Constitution. And there is a way for you to eliminate some of your data that's being sold through those brokers by visiting today's sponsor. If you've ever received random text messages telling you about lost packages or had emails offering you a free computer, you've likely been victimized by data brokers. These are companies that sell your data without your consent to marketers, scammers, and even stalkers, all while earning billions of dollars in the process. Legally, they have to remove your information if you ask. So of course, they make the entire process confusing and excruciating, which is where today's video sponsor comes in. Aura is an all-in-one digital security asset that can quickly remove your information from these data broker sites and keep it off. I've used Aura for this exact purpose, and I'll be honest, the amount of data broker sites my information appeared on was alarming. Almost immediately after creating my account, Aura had already identified multiple security issues. If you use my link, aura.com/magicprepper, not only will you find out if your information is on these scandalous sites, but you'll also be provided with alerts if your info is found on the dark web, real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, 24/7 monitoring to keep your identity secure, a secure VPN, antivirus, password manager, and other utilities, not to mention a US-backed customer support that's always available. Plus, just for peace of mind, Aura included $5 million of identity theft insurance protection with US fraud experts available to help at any time. Finding out my information was being sold for malicious purposes ticked me off, so Aura was an easy decision. Stick it to the data brokers and secure your online presence. Once again, use my link aura.com/magicprepper to try Aura for free for 14 days and take control of your digital footprint. All right, big thanks to Aura for supporting the channel and of course providing people a way to remove their data from those data brokers who are going to sell it maliciously to companies that want to track your every move. Now, let's first start talking about going to work and paying bills. In Ukraine right now, people are still going to work. They're commuting to work and they are collecting a paycheck and they are paying their bills. They haven't escaped rent. They haven't escaped their utilities. These are things that people talk about a lot in preparedness regarding SHTF as finally being free of our debt. But from what we're currently seeing in Ukraine, that's just not the case. These people are still having to deal with all the financial ramifications of living in modern society, but guess what? Also with a war going on. So, although they're still going to work and although they're still paying their bills, there's something else that you need to prepare for and be ready for regarding disruption, because their cost of living is also up. Prices have skyrocketed because of what's happening there. And so if you wanted to take a lesson from that, even though you'd still be going to work and paying your bills, your money is going to go less far compared to what it does right now if you were to experience a similar event. So you should be preparing to have additional funds on hand for an emergency. I know that's very basic and something that all of us support the concept of, but how many of us are lacking in that department? probably the majority. So understand that SHTF doesn't mean you'll immediately have to stop paying your bills, and that the fact that you're broke right now will finally go away. It'll just make it worse. You'll be able to afford even less than you can now, and you'll struggle to pay your bills even harder, and the bank is still going to come collect even though missiles are hitting right outside of your window. So that's a big takeaway, because you should be preparing to have that financial breathing room in an emergency instead of planning on not having to pay for anything. Now, let's look at Gaza, who has advanced in SHTF versus what Ukraine is experiencing because of their status prior to their current invasion scenario, right? Now, Gaza is already at an 80% unemployment rate, which means it's probably even higher than that. So nobody's really working, right? Gaza is pretty much shut down because of how far into it they have gone, and because of their status before the war with Israel. So, what's going on in Gaza? Are they still paying their bills? Well, kind of. A lot of things have shut down, so some of our thoughts about SHTF to that point are relevant and valid. However, the only way to get things in Gaza right now is with cash. And so that is another really important takeaway, because even in a completely destroyed society where people aren't actually going to work and aren't probably really paying bills in the traditional way that we think of it, the ones who still had money in the bank or had some money set aside before all of this are having to source cash, and they're having to deal with unethical brokers in order to get it, because the only way to get anything in Gaza right now is with cash. And these brokers are charging 40 to 80% fees for these people retrieving their cash because of how short cash has become in the region, because of how important it suddenly is. So now for every dollar you want to pull out of your bank, you're going to pay 40 cents in order to get that dollar in cash. But without doing that, you can't buy anything. So an important takeaway there is that people in Gaza, and yes, it's a different circumstance, which is why we're comparing these two. People in Gaza aren't using gold and silver to pay for stuff. They're not trading and bartering so much. I'm sure some of that is happening, don't get me wrong, but there's not much to trade and barter, because anything that people need, they actually need. So what we're finding with Gaza, at least for a preparedness lesson of sorts, is that having cash is still important, even in a fully war-torn, completely collapsed society. It's still the only thing people are accepting for basic goods and necessities. So, cash should be part of your emergency plan. Don't think of SHTF as suddenly no one's using cash and suddenly no one cares about that kind of stuff, and that you'll be trading 22 long rifle for rabbits or whatever it is. That's not necessarily how it's going to work out. And I think we should be upgrading our understanding of SHTF based on what we're witnessing now, because there's a very small, microscopic chance that it'll actually affect the whole world all at once. And so it's more regional, right, with what we're seeing currently. And if it happens to your region, things like cash will still matter to everybody else, because the banks will still be online, right? Like, these are things to kind of just keep in mind and to consider when you're planning for your own personal preparedness. So things are going to cost more, and you're still going to go to work, and you're still going to pay your bills. And if things have gotten so bad that they're to the point of what we're seeing in Gaza right now, you probably still need cash. So make sure you have some cash stashed away as well. And if you're already broke to the point where you can't really stash away any cash, and you couldn't afford for your bills to go up, now you can at least mentally prepare for that, with the understanding that things will be extremely difficult for you, because SHTF is unlikely to happen just overnight. And there will be months and months, or in Ukraine's situation, years of you struggling even harder than you are now, and all of the same expectations being placed upon you. So that is what we're going to be talking about with going to work and paying your bills in SHTF. This is why we were wrong. I'm not saying you were wrong only. I'm saying I was wrong about some things too, based on these current examples. And the next thing we're going to talk about is communications, okay? So this is a very interesting one, because most people, when they prepare for SHTF, they think about things in the sense of, you know, oh, you're going to need radios, right? Because there won't be any internet, there won't be any phones, there won't be any other way to communicate besides very basic analog technology, right? Which is reasonable thing to assume based on some of the natural disasters we've experienced here in the US, especially with Hurricane Helene. We saw how important radios became in the sense of communication. But for full-blown SHTF, things don't always work out the way you think they will. And right now in Ukraine, people still have access to the internet and phones. Yes, service is somewhat intermittent, but they're still using their phone. They can still make a phone call. They can still send an email. They can still get online. Right now, it is somewhat restricted and limited based on what's happening in their area, of course. And if infrastructure suddenly gets damaged, then of course there are service outages and things of that nature. But the bigger takeaway is that a lot of what they've been able to access is due to Starlink, right? And of course, I think Starlink is a good idea for you to have on hand as an emergency prep as well. But another thing to consider is that people control these companies and they control these telecommunication outlets. And Starlink was actually shut down because Ukraine went on the counteroffensive at a certain point, and Elon Musk basically said, I don't think you should do that, and turned off their internet. Basically. There's a lot more to it than that, but we're not talking about that right now. But the point of the conversation here is to understand that there's a good chance that if China invades tomorrow, we'll still have internet and phones. Doesn't mean necessarily you should use them, especially if you're involved in anything that China might not appreciate, but there's a good chance we'll still have them because you'll be going to work and calling your boss to let him know you're running late because guys in blue helmets are blocking the road, right? Like these things are likely based on what we're seeing in Ukraine. And at any point, you should also keep in mind that that phone service and that internet service could just be shut off because somebody decides you shouldn't have access to it due to what your government did or due to what a faction did within your area or who knows what else, right? So there's still a high likelihood you'll be able to bust your phone out in SHTF. Because I'm sorry, but I consider what Ukraine's going through right now SHTF. And I also definitely consider what Gaza's going through right now to be SHTF. They're on different timelines in many ways, which is great in the sense of what we can learn, but bad for everybody involved because both of them are terrible situations, right? So what do we learn from Gaza regarding communications? Because like I said, they're the advanced SHTF. They're like over the cliff, right? Like they're almost end of the world status in many ways. Okay, in Gaza, they don't have phones and internet. So there is some truth to that thought process of not having access to it during SHTF. It just depends on which type we're dealing with. Their stuff's pretty much shut down militarily by the invading force because of a media blackout, right? Well, what are they doing? They're using radios. Yep, they're back to it, and the only way for them to receive any type of intelligence or news about what's happening either in Gaza or outside of Gaza is through the radio. And there's broadcasters in Gaza right now that are just basically turning on Al Jazeera and then just letting a radio transmit it so that other people can hear what's happening. And that is the only thing they're really able to use in the sense of communication. So it does demonstrate that having access to radios is still important. And of course, there's a lot of different levels of radio. And yes, ham radio is going to give you the most capability, but it's also one of the more complicated ones to get into, as well as the licensing and everything else involved with it. But you can get a GMRS license by just paying a fee without having to take an entire course or do anything like that. So that might be a consideration to kind of surpass what you can access with FRS and with your basic, standard radios that you buy at the store, your walkie-talkies, right? But even at that point, those FRS radios are still more useful than nothing, and they still usually can receive AM and FM signals as well as NOAA, so you can understand, weather or emergency updates. So any sort of radio really is important for SHTF. Having higher capabilities is good, but be understanding of the fact, and this is just from personal experience, this is something that I think maybe we need to address a little bit better in this community. If you're gonna get really into radio, it's something you kind of have to commit to. And it's better, in my experience and in my, I guess, opinion, it's better to have that guy or that gal in your group that focuses on radio and comms and knows how to do it than it is to try to force yourself to be an expert at it while also doing every other thing as well. Because it's really hard to commit that when you're trying to do a million other things. That's just been my experience. But, you know, I've got my GMRS license. I understand how to use basic radios, and I do have a ham radio transceiver and all that kind of stuff. So like, it's still important to have. I just wanted to mention that. But yes, Gaza right now, advanced SHTF, no phone, no internet, just radio. So some truth to that one, but also some truth to the fact that we'll likely have phone and internet for a big portion of SHTF unless something catastrophic occurs in the immediate, which would be like an asteroid strike, right? 3i Atlas, anybody? I don't know. So now let's talk about transportation, because this is a big one that people seem to really hyper focus on, and I think generally get wrong a lot of the time, right? This is why I'm saying we're wrong, because if you ask anybody in SHTF, will there be internet or phones? They'll say, no. In SHTF, will you go to work and pay your bills? No. Well, Ukraine says otherwise, and in some ways Gaza says otherwise, right? Transportation's a big one too, because people will generally say, oh, you won't have your car, you won't be able to get around, you know, you got to get a horse, you know, you got to have a buggy to pull behind you. Okay, in Ukraine right now, everybody's still driving to work. Everybody's driving in general. And one thing to keep in mind to kind of prepare for in that regard is that, yeah, they're driving to work, but gas is scarce and costs like, I don't know, twice as much as it does in the US right now. So your bills, like you're gonna be paying, right? Your gas bill being one of those is gonna be higher by double. But guess what? You're still going to work, so you still need that gas. And as long as there is gas and as long as people can drive, they will. So yes, in Ukraine right now, people are just still driving in their cars. So there's a good chance you'll have access to your vehicle. Now, in Ukraine, they're also buying vehicles to bring to the front lines. They've been scouring the European and US markets for used trucks so that they can use them for battlefield purposes. So even in the actual war where the fighting is occurring, people are still driving vehicles, which we all know. They have drones, they have aircraft, they have, you know, all types of different vehicles. But there is that understanding that people tend to stick to of like, oh, in SHTF we won't have cars, because for some reason we always assume that we'll go in tandem with an EMP or something like that. But that's not what we're seeing in Ukraine at all. So keep that in mind. Good chance you'll still have your car. So your bug out plans don't necessarily have to revolve around being on foot, although you should have redundancy plans in case they are forced to be on foot. And that's where we can jump into what's going on in Gaza regarding transportation. And this is actually interesting because even in Gaza, where transportation is limited and where they don't actually have access to their vehicles because they either don't have fuel, right? Or the roads are plugged up with debris and vehicles that broke down or ran out of gas or anything else, right? So there's basically no one driving cars around Gaza. And if they are, they're probably being lit up by some kind of military unit because, you know, why are they driving around, right? Like that's bringing a lot of attention on yourself in a place where nobody's driving anything. But what they are doing is using donkey-drawn carts. Animal-drawn carts is how Gazans are getting supplies from one side of the city to the next, right? Like that is what they're doing right now and have been doing basically since, you know, Israel took over. So what do we learn from that? Even in an environment of SHTF where there's no vehicles and no fuel and everybody actually is grounded in that regard, they're not going by foot, they're using animals, just like we used to, right? So donkeys and carts is the name of the game there, and that is much more efficient than trying to walk with everything on your back, right? And so that's something to consider. I'm not saying everybody who lives in an apartment can just go out and get a donkey for just in case, right? That's definitely not how it's gonna work. But just be aware of the fact that if you are on foot, there will be many others who won't necessarily need to be and will have access to other forms of transportation that might not be fuel dependent, but are more efficient and more practical than being on foot. Okay, so, and you can see like how this timeline works, right? So if Ukraine lasts for the next 10 years and supplies and aid gets cut off and there's no additional intervention from any other nations and they're locked into their situation and no longer have any type of, you know, resupply, it could look like Gaza at some point, and then this is what they'll be faced with, right? But for now, which is similar to like what I assume the US would look like, they do have cars and they do have gas and all that stuff. And the reason I think it'd be similar to the US is because of the infrastructure and level of economy and everything else related to that they had in place before their major SHTF situation. Whereas Gaza was much more third world than Ukraine before all this started happening. And so the closer you are to that right now, the faster you'll get there, if that makes sense. Last thing, infrastructure, okay? In Ukraine right now, generally, water and electricity is still accessible. Less than before, and with service interruptions, but still relatively accessible, which is how people are still able to go to work and pay their bills, right? Now, of course, infrastructure has been attacked by Russia, and that has limited their capacity for being able to supply water and electricity to their citizens, but it's there. Now, there is a good takeaway here from that situation that you should definitely keep in mind. And this kind of applies to Gaza as well, in the sense that the areas that are currently occupied by Russia, so the front lines that are behind enemy lines as of right now, are having a much harder time getting water and electricity, but specifically water. And there's shortages and there's scarcity because the infrastructure has been damaged and the ability to rebuild it and restabilize is diminished because they are currently on the front lines behind enemy territory. So that kind of explains some of what's going on in Gaza as well, because that's how their whole situation is right now. So I would say, based on that information, that if you are in an environment where there's an occupying force and you are occupied and you have basically lost, right, the war at that point in time, then you'll experience Gaza-like conditions much sooner and much more egregiously than if you are not occupied, right? Because that's basically what Ukraine is showing us in that regard. The areas that are not occupied, and especially the regions that are further west, tend to have better access to clean water and electricity. And then once you get to the front lines, and especially to the occupied regions that Russia currently controls, all of that becomes drastically harder to source. So let's talk about Gaza with infrastructure. Electricity there is basically non-existent, and the water is polluted and completely inaccessible. And in fact, the only way people are getting water in Gaza is from aid trucks. So that sounds more like full-blown SHTF now, doesn't it? However, it is kind of interesting that one of the proposals for Gaza to be able to rebuild and reset infrastructure-wise when it comes to how they can move forward from all of this is by utilizing solar power. Because rebuilding your entire electric infrastructure is expensive, time-consuming, and unlikely in their current conditions. But deploying solar panels and wiring up some batteries in order to store some of that energy and then use at a later time isn't as intense. So it's a lot more practical for them to possibly move more towards a self-reliant platform of deploying solar on an individual basis. And that's an interesting point now, isn't it? Because even in full-blown SHTF, which Gaza is basically in, yeah, you're right. Electricity, maybe not accessible. Clean water, are aid trucks showing up? Full-blown SHTF, probably not likely, right? Like, especially if we're talking catastrophic events. It's unlikely the UN's going to show up with aid trucks if the entire area is radioactive, right? But even with that all, being known, and even with Gaza being in the situation they're in, which might as well in some cases be a wasteland at this point, right? Solar still has a place because it's the least intrusive infrastructure that an individual can deploy and actually use efficiently. Is it the best form of energy in the sense of what it can produce? No, it's not super efficient, don't get me wrong. But man, if there's no gasoline and there's no propane and you don't have water, right? Because you can't even get water to drink out of any kind of natural source, then it sounds to me like gas-powered generators or hydroelectric generators are kind of out the window. And if your main infrastructure power generation is down and you don't have access to wind power, what else is there really that you could easily deploy and use, well, for an individual? It's just solar. So, great takeaway there in the sense of why having access to that capability is important. Gaza's demonstrating it right now. So, that's why we were wrong about SHTF, because I think we had a lot of these things kind of ingrained in our minds based on apocalyptic concepts around SHTF. But I don't think anyone would look at what's happening in Ukraine right now and just be like, no, that's not quite SHTF, right? That doesn't quite qualify. Being invaded by a nuclear superpower, I don't know if it really meets the criteria, right? Like, I would say it does. I would say if China invaded the US, we would call that SHTF, right? But man, I have a feeling based on what we're currently witnessing that even if that happened, we would probably still go to work and still pay our bills. Why? Because the banks are still going to be asking for that money. So let me know in the comments below what you think about this little discussion, because I've just been kind of going through it lately when it comes to my plans and my philosophies of preparedness regarding what's likely and what's practical and what I can learn from what's happening right now. And this is kind of where I'm at with, well, the examples I have access to. And of course, I can be wrong about things too, so I'd love to hear your feedback there. I will never present myself as somebody who knows everything about anything, because I don't even know if that's an accurate thing to say, but it felt right, and here we are. Yes, very philosophical Magic Prepper is. So, anything else you need from me, go to magicprepper.com. Go down in the description as well as in the pinned comment, because I have some other stuff there as well that can help support the channel and support some good causes. And besides that, it's going to be it for Magic Prepper.